The day my father sat me down at the kitchen table of the house I grew up in, looked me in the eyes, and told me he was leaving everything, the house, the car, the business, every single thing he had spent 30 years building, to my brother, I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not beg. I looked at him across that table, with the afternoon light coming through the window behind him the way it always had, making everything look warmer and more ordinary than it felt, and I said, very quietly, "Okay, Dad. I understand." He looked almost disappointed that I didn't fight back. He had no idea that the fight had already started. It just wasn't happening where he could see it. My name is Elena Vasquez. And what I'm about to tell you is the story of how my father spent 30 years deciding I wasn't worth investing in, and how I spent the last 4 years building something so undeniable that the day he finally understood what he had dismissed, it broke something in him that has never fully healed. This is not a story about hatred. I want to be clear about that from the beginning. This is a story about a woman who was told she didn't matter, who believed it for too long, who stopped believing it at exactly the right moment, and who made absolutely sure the people who underestimated her understood the full cost of that mistake. Stay with me. Because what happened is something I still find almost impossible to believe, even though I lived every single minute of it. You need to understand my father before you can understand anything else about this story. Because Raymond Vasquez was not a simple villain. He was something more complicated and, in many ways, more painful than that, a man who loved his children genuinely and unequally, and who had convinced himself that the inequality was justified. My father built Vasquez Fabrication over the course of his adult life. It was a metal fabrication and manufacturing company, not glamorous, not the kind of business that gets written about in magazines, but solid and real and genuinely profitable. He started it with a second-hand machine, a rented industrial space the size of a 2-car garage, and the specific stubbornness of a man who believes that work, applied with enough consistency, will eventually become legacy. He was right. By the time I was growing up, the business employed 22 people and had contracts with 3 regional construction companies that kept the floor running year-round. The house we lived in was paid for. The cars in the driveway were owned outright. My father had built something from nothing, and he was, in the way of men who have done exactly that, enormously proud of it. The problem, the slow, structural, foundational problem that shaped everything that followed, was that my father had decided, early and completely, that this legacy had one rightful heir. My brother Marco. Marco was 3 years older than me, broad-shouldered, easy with people, and from the time he was old enough to follow my father onto the shop floor, positioned as the son who would carry the Vasquez name forward. My father took him to the business on Saturdays. Taught him the machines. Introduced him to clients with the words, "My son, who will be running this place one day." He talked about Marco and the business as though they were a single sentence, you couldn't say one without meaning the other. And me? I was the daughter. I want to be precise about what that meant in my father's world, because it wasn't cruelty exactly, it was a framework. A set of assumptions so deep they had become invisible, the way water doesn't know it's wet. My father loved me. I genuinely believe that. But in his framework, the business, the legacy, the real thing, was a masculine inheritance. Daughters were loved. Sons were built into something. I absorbed this framework without realizing I was absorbing it, the way children absorb everything that exists before they have language for it. It simply was the way things were. Marco would run the business. I would do something else. What something else, my father never quite specified, because it never quite occurred to him that it required specification. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was my mother's silence. My mother, Rosa, was a woman of considerable intelligence and zero confrontation. She had grown up in a home with similar architecture, fathers and sons, daughters and patients, and she had carried that architecture forward into her own marriage without examining it. She loved my father and she loved both her children, and she saw, I am certain, what the disparity was doing to me over the years. She said nothing. Not once. Not when my father forgot to come to my school presentations because he was at the shop with Marco. Not when the business college brochures I brought home mysteriously never became dinner table discussions the way Marco's career plans did. Not when my father said, at a family dinner when I was 17, in response to my question about whether I might work at the business after school, "The shop floor is no place for you, Elena. You'll find your path somewhere else." Somewhere else. Unspecified, unplanned, unsupported somewhere else. My mother looked at her plate. I looked at my father. And for the first time in my life, not the last, but the first, I felt the full weight of what it meant to be the child he wasn't building toward anything. I went to my room that night and I sat with it for a long time. And somewhere in that sitting, something that had been soft and hoping became quiet and determined. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with that determination. But I felt it settle into me like something that intended to stay. I need to tell you about the years between that dinner and the day my father called me to the kitchen table, because those years are the architecture of everything. I did not go into the family business. That door had been closed before I ever reached it. Instead, I went to the state university on a partial scholarship, funded partly by savings I had accumulated from after-school jobs that my father had never fully acknowledged as serious, and partly by student loans I would spend years repaying. I studied business administration, because even then, even without anyone encouraging it, without a single person in my immediate family suggesting it made sense, something in me was oriented toward understanding how organizations worked, how money moved, how small operations could be built into significant ones. I graduated in 3.5 years. Not 4, 3.5, because I took summer sessions to reduce my loan burden. Nobody came to the graduation ceremony. My mother wanted to, but my father had a client meeting he said he couldn't reschedule, and in the Vasquez household, my father's schedule organized everyone else's. My mother sent flowers to my apartment. A nice arrangement. I put them on my kitchen table and looked at them for several days and thought about what the next chapter was going to look like. I got a job at a mid-sized manufacturing consulting firm. Entry level, which meant I was doing everything from spreadsheet management to client note-taking to running errands for senior consultants, but I was inside the world I understood, the world of manufacturing operations, of production efficiency, of the specific problems that businesses like my father's faced at scale. I was good at it. Not immediately, not all at once, but genuinely and increasingly good at it, in the way that happens when someone finds the work that fits the shape of how their mind operates. I got promoted after 18 months. Then again 14 months after that. By the time I was 26, I was a mid-level consultant running my own client engagements, and 2 of my clients had specifically requested me for repeat projects. I told my father about the promotions. Both times. He said, "That's nice, Elena," in the tone he used for news that was pleasant but not important, and returned to whatever he had been talking about before. Marco, meanwhile, had joined the business at 22 and was being groomed openly, enthusiastically, for ownership. My father took him on supplier trips. Introduced him to the accountants and lawyers who kept the business running. Put his name on documents. Had him sit in on negotiations. I watched all of this during holiday visits and occasional family dinners, and I felt what I had felt since that night at 17, quiet, settled determination. I was building something. It was just taking time to understand exactly what. And then my father called me to the kitchen table. And everything changed. I was 28 years old. My father had called and asked me to come home for a weekend visit, which was unusual. He didn't typically initiate visits. He said he had something he wanted to discuss. My mother, when I asked her what it was about, said she didn't know, in the specific voice she used when she did know and wasn't going to tell me. I drove home on a Friday evening. We had dinner. Normal, surface-level conversation. My father asked about my work in the abbreviated way he always did, enough to appear interested, not enough to actually engage with the details. Saturday morning, after breakfast, he said, "Sit down, Elena." I want to talk to you about the future. I sat down. He talked for about 15 minutes. He told me he had been thinking about the transition of the business, about what would happen when he was ready to step back. He told me he had updated his estate documents to formalize what had always been understood. He told me the business would go to Marco, including the operational assets, the client contracts, the equipment, the building that housed the shop floor, which the company owned outright. He told me the house would also go to Marco, because Marco had a family, he had married 2 years earlier and had a young son, and needed the stability. He told me the car, his car, a truck he was inordinately proud of, which had become a symbol in our family of adult arrival, would also go to Marco. And then he said the thing that I have never forgotten and never will. He said, the business needs someone who has been part of it, who understands it from the ground up. Marco has been building toward this his whole life. You've built your own path, which is good for you. But this requires someone who has earned it the right way. The right way. As though the reason I hadn't earned it was a personal failing rather than a door that had been locked before I ever reached it. As though the career I had built, the clients I had served, the promotions I had earned, the loans I had repaid, the education I had funded largely myself, none of that constituted earning anything the right way because it had happened outside the specific geography of his approval. I looked at my father across the kitchen table. And I said, "Okay, Dad. I understand." He looked almost disappointed that I didn't fight back. He really had no idea. I drove home that Saturday afternoon with the radio off and the windows down, letting the air do what air does when you need to think rather than feel. I drove the 3 hours between my parents' house and my apartment in the specific state of clarity that sometimes follows a wound, the space after impact where the pain hasn't arrived yet but the information has, and your mind is running pure and cold and fast. By the time I pulled into my parking spot, I had the outline of something. Not revenge yet. Not a plan. An outline. A sense of direction that I hadn't had before, because before Saturday morning I had still been operating under a quiet hope that things might be different, that my father might, eventually, see me. That hope was gone now. Cleanly and completely gone. And the absence of hope is not always despair. Sometimes it's clarity. I went inside. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table, my table, in my apartment, that I paid for myself, and I started writing. What I wrote, that first evening, was not a revenge plan. It was an honest assessment. I listed everything I knew, my skills, my experience, my professional network, my understanding of manufacturing operations. I listed what I had access to that Marco didn't, years of consulting work that had given me exposure to dozens of manufacturing businesses, their problems, their solutions, their growth patterns. I listed what I knew about my father's business specifically, not from the inside, because I had never been allowed inside, but from the outside, with the analytical eye I had developed professionally. And I listed what I had noticed, over years of watching from the outside, that no one inside the business seemed to have noticed. The business had a problem. A structural one. It was profitable, but it was operating on a margin that was significantly thinner than it needed to be, and the reason was an inefficiency in the production scheduling that I had identified years ago and never said anything about because when I had tried, once, to mention something about the business to my father, he had smiled and said, "Leave the shop floor to the people who know it." I knew it. I had known it for 3 years. And no one inside had seen it. I wrote that down. And then I started making calls. The first call was to a woman named Patricia Huang, who was a senior partner at the firm where I worked. Patricia was someone I trusted professionally and had worked closely with for 2 years. She was sharp, direct, and had a specific expertise in manufacturing operations restructuring that made her one of the most valuable people in my professional network. I told Patricia I was thinking about leaving the firm to start my own practice. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been wondering when you were going to figure that out." "I need advice," I said. "Come in Monday," she said. "Bring everything you have." The second call was to a client of mine, a man named David Osei, who ran a metal parts manufacturing company about 40 miles from my father's business. David and I had worked together on 2 engagements, and he had once said, at the end of our second project, that if I ever went independent he wanted to be my first client. "I haven't forgotten what you said," I told him. "Neither have I," he said. "What are you building?" "Something real," I said. "I'll have a proposal for you in 3 weeks." The third call was the one that surprised me, even as I made it. I called my mother. Not to tell her what I was doing. Not yet. I called her because I had a question that had been forming since the drive home, and it required an answer that only she could give me. "Mom," I said, "how much do you know about Dad's current contracts? The supplier relationships, the client roster?" A pause. "Why are you asking?" "Because I need to know something," I said. "And I need to know if you would tell me, if you knew." Another pause. Longer. "Your father loves you," she said finally. It was not an answer to my question. But it was information. "I know he does," I said. "In the way he knows how." She was quiet. "The Henderson contract is up for renewal next spring," she said finally. Her voice was careful, the voice of someone stepping carefully across uncertain ground. "It's the largest one. Your father has been nervous about it for months. He doesn't think Marco has the relationship management skills to handle the renewal negotiation." The Henderson contract. Their largest client. Renewal negotiation. Nervous. "Thank you, Mom," I said. "Elena," she said. "I know," I said. "I'll be careful." I wasn't going to be careful. But I appreciated her saying it. Let me tell you what I built over the next 14 months, because the building is the story. I left the firm 6 weeks after my conversation with Patricia, who gave me her blessing and, more practically, 3 referrals from her personal network that became my first consulting clients. I registered a business, Vasquez Operations Consulting, which I named with a deliberateness that I will explain later, and set up an office in a co-working space that was modest but professional. David Osei was my anchor client, as promised. His company had exactly the kind of operational inefficiencies that I had spent years learning to identify and fix, and within the first 4 months of our engagement, I had improved his production margin by 11%. He told everyone he knew. The referrals came. I was not operating in a vacuum. I was building in the specific geography of the regional manufacturing industry, the same geography my father's business occupied, the same client world, the same supplier networks, the same industry associations. I attended every relevant event. I introduced myself to everyone. I built relationships with the care and consistency of someone who understands that a professional reputation is a long-term construction project. And I did something else. Something that required patience of a specific and demanding kind. I began building a relationship with Henderson Manufacturing. The Henderson contract was the largest in my father's client portfolio, a relationship that had been the anchor of Vasquez Fabrication's revenue for 11 years. It was, as my mother had said, up for renewal the following spring. And it was, as she had also said, a negotiation my father was nervous about. I didn't approach Henderson with anything related to my father's business. I approached them as what I was, a manufacturing operations consultant with a track record of improving margins and production efficiency. I reached out to their operations director through a mutual connection from an industry association event. I offered a complimentary operational review of one of their smaller production lines. They said yes. The review took 3 weeks. The recommendations I provided saved them an estimated $400,000 annually in production waste and scheduling inefficiency. The operations director, a man named Gary Sinclair who had been in manufacturing for 25 years and had seen enough consultants to know the difference between the ones who produced results and the ones who produced reports, took me to lunch afterward and said, "Who else knows about you?" "Not enough people," I said. That's going to change, he said. I wish I could say that was the end of the building phase. It wasn't. The most important piece was still coming. 8 months into running my practice, I discovered something that I had suspected but needed to confirm. The production scheduling inefficiency I had identified in my father's business years earlier, the one I had never been allowed to address, had gotten worse. Not dramatically, not in a way that was visible from the outside, but measurably. I knew this because one of my new clients was a supplier who worked with Vasquez Fabrication, and in the course of our engagement, the supplier mentioned, as an aside, as operational context, that delivery timing coordination with Vasquez had become increasingly complicated. They're running behind on 2 of their major production lines, the supplier said. Been that way for about 6 months. Something off in their scheduling. Their floor manager is good, but whoever is managing the planning side doesn't seem to have a handle on the bottlenecks. Whoever is managing the planning side. Marco had taken over production planning 8 months earlier. My father had given him the role as part of the formal transition process. And Marco, who was good with people and capable in many ways, had never been trained in the operational complexity of production scheduling at scale. This was the bottleneck I had identified years ago, now being actively mismanaged by someone who didn't know what he didn't know. I sat with this information carefully. I thought about what to do with it and, more importantly, what not to do with it. There was a version of this where I approached my father and offered to help, where I tried, one more time, to offer what I had and be received in a way I never had been. I thought about that version for about 30 seconds before I set it aside. My father had told me I hadn't earned the right way. I was going to show him what the right way looked like. And I was going to do it publicly, in front of the people whose opinions shaped his professional world, at a moment of his own making. The Henderson contract renewal was scheduled for a meeting in April. I knew this because Gary Sinclair had, over the 8 months of our growing professional relationship, become something close to a mentor, a connection who valued what I brought and communicated openly about his company's situation. What I had not known, what I discovered 3 weeks before the April meeting, in a conversation with Gary that started casually and became very significant, was that Henderson Manufacturing had been considering consolidating their fabrication contracts, simplifying their supplier portfolio, moving volume from 2 or 3 vendors to one anchor relationship. Gary mentioned this in the context of my consulting work. He was thinking about the operational implications of consolidation, the risk concentration, the transition costs, the quality control considerations. The Vasquez contract is one of the ones under review, he said, not unkindly. I was quiet for a moment. What would it take, I said carefully, to be confident in a fabrication partner at the volume you're considering? He described what Henderson was looking for: operational consistency, production scheduling reliability, a management structure that could handle scale, and specifically, evidence that the relationship had the professional capacity to grow with Henderson's needs rather than being a constraint on them. Operational consistency. Production scheduling reliability. Management structure. I had a proposal in front of Gary Sinclair within 72 hours. It was not a proposal to take Henderson away from Vasquez Fabrication. Not exactly. It was a proposal for Henderson to retain Vasquez Fabrication as their anchor fabrication partner, under an operational management structure that included my firm as the production planning and operations consultant, with measurable performance benchmarks, a defined improvement timeline, and my professional guarantee attached to the outcomes. In other words, I proposed a structure in which Vasquez Fabrication kept the Henderson contract, but only under my management guidance. My father's business, saved by the daughter he had dismissed, and restructured so that my involvement was contractually embedded in its most important client relationship. Gary read the proposal twice. Then he looked at me across his desk and said, "Is there a family dimension to this that I should know about?" "Yes," I said. "My father owns Vasquez Fabrication." He didn't think I had what it takes to contribute to the business. I'm proposing to prove otherwise in the context that matters most to him. Gary was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, he raised someone with more operational acumen than anyone I've worked with in 5 years. That's interesting parenting. It is, I said. I'll take this to our leadership team, he said. I think the answer is yes. But Elena, your father doesn't know any of this yet? No, I said. When does he find out? When the meeting happens, I said. In April. What happened next shocked everyone. Gary's leadership team approved the proposal within 10 days. The structure was exactly as I had outlined, Vasquez Fabrication as Henderson's anchor fabrication partner, with a 3-year contract renewal at a volume that represented a 30% increase from the previous agreement, contingent on the operational improvements outlined in my consulting scope. The April meeting was set. Gary had one condition: I had to be in the room. Henderson's position was that the proposal had been developed by me, the performance benchmarks were mine, and the professional guarantee was mine, which meant they needed me present for the contract discussion, regardless of what that meant for the family dynamics. I agreed. I did not tell my father I was coming. I told my mother the week before. Not everything, but enough. I called her and said, I need you to make sure Dad goes to the Henderson meeting. Don't let Marco handle it. This one needs to be Dad. A long silence. Elena, she said. What are you doing? I'm doing what he told me I couldn't, I said. Another silence. And then, quietly, so quietly I almost missed it. Okay. She made sure he went. The Henderson meeting was at their offices. A conference room on the 3rd floor with a long table and windows that looked out over their production facility, the kind of view that's meant to remind visitors that the people on this side of the table have built something real and intend to protect it. I arrived early. Gary met me in the lobby and walked me up. We talked quietly in the hallway for a few minutes about the structure of the presentation, the order of items on the agenda, the key decision-makers in the room. Your father is going to be surprised, Gary said. Yes, I said. How do you think he'll respond? I thought about Raymond Vasquez. About the kitchen table. About the right way. About the 30 years of building he had done and the daughter he had never built toward anything. He's going to have to make a choice, I said. In front of people who matter to him professionally. He can accept what I've put together, which saves his most important client relationship and possibly his business. Or he can refuse, because it comes from me, and lose the contract. Gary looked at me for a moment. That's a hard position to put him in. He put me in a harder one, I said. For a lot longer. Gary nodded slowly. Fair enough. We went inside. My father arrived with Marco 7 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to start. I was already seated on the Henderson side of the table, not at the head, but clearly present, clearly associated with the Henderson team. The moment my father walked through the door and saw me, I watched his face go through 4 things in rapid succession. Surprise. Confusion. A quick recalculation. And then something that I can only describe as the expression of a man who has just realized that the room is not shaped the way he thought it was. He stopped in the doorway. Marco walked in behind him and also stopped when he saw me, with a different expression, less complicated, more simply startled. Elena, my father said. Hi, Dad, I said. Hi, Marco. Gary stood and extended his hand to my father. Raymond. Good to see you. Thank you for coming. I believe you know Elena, she's been doing some operations consulting work for us, and she's developed a proposal that I think is going to be very good for both of our companies. My father shook Gary's hand. His expression was controlled now, he was a professional, and whatever was happening internally was being managed behind the surface. He sat down. Marco sat beside him. Across from me. The Henderson team presented first. The context for the contract renewal, the consolidation strategy, the performance requirements going forward. My father listened with the focus of a man who understood the stakes. And then Gary turned the floor to me. I presented for 22 minutes. I walked through the operational analysis, the production scheduling inefficiency, the margin impact, the specific improvements that were achievable with the right intervention. I presented the data clearly and completely, without editorializing, without any reference to family dynamics or personal history. This was professional work, presented professionally, in a room full of people who would evaluate it on its merits. And the merits were real. I had done this work. I knew it thoroughly. I had spent 14 months building a practice and a reputation specifically so that when this moment arrived, the weight of my credibility would be independent of anyone's prior assessment of me, including my father's. The room was attentive in the way that rooms are attentive when they understand that something significant is being laid out in front of them. I finished the presentation and outlined the proposal structure, the 3-year renewal, the volume increase, the consulting scope, the performance benchmarks. This structure, I said, gives Henderson the operational reliability you need for consolidation, and gives Vasquez Fabrication a contractual framework that protects the relationship and positions the business for growth. I looked at my father. It's a good deal for the business, I said. For both sides. The room was quiet for a moment. Gary looked at my father. Raymond. What are you thinking? I want to describe what happened on my father's face in the silence after Gary asked that question, because it is the image I have returned to more times than I can count. He was looking at the proposal documents in front of him. He had been looking at them for the last several minutes of my presentation, not ignoring me, but processing the documents alongside my words, the way a man who built a business processes information, practically, concretely, with the numbers in front of him. And what the numbers showed was undeniable. The production scheduling inefficiency I had identified, the one that had been my father's blind spot for years and Marco's active problem for the past 8 months, represented an annual margin loss of approximately $280,000. The improvements I had outlined would recover most of that. The Henderson contract renewal at the proposed volume increase would add revenue that, combined with the margin recovery, would make this the most profitable period in Vasquez Fabrication's history. My father was looking at proof that his daughter, the one he had told wasn't worthy, the one he had directed toward somewhere else, the one he had dismissed from the kitchen table 14 months ago, had not only identified the most significant operational problem in his business but had constructed a solution that saved his most important client relationship at the same time. He looked up from the documents. He looked at me. And I watched my father, Raymond Vasquez, who had built a business from nothing and believed entirely in his own judgment, encounter the full, documented, professionally validated reality of what he had dismissed. His jaw moved slightly. Something in his eyes, something I had never seen there in the direction of me, shifted. You did all of this, he said. Not a question. More like a sentence he was testing the weight of. Yes, I said. The operational analysis. Yes. The Henderson relationship. I built it over the past year, I said. On my own. He looked down at the documents again. Then back at me. Then at Gary Sinclair, who was watching this exchange with the careful neutrality of someone who understands they are witnessing something that goes beyond the business at hand. She's good, Raymond, Gary said. Simply, directly. She's very good. Marco had not said a word since sitting down. I glanced at him now, my brother, who had been given everything I hadn't, who had been handed a role he was struggling with in ways he probably hadn't fully admitted to himself. He was looking at the proposal documents with an expression that was neither hostile nor celebratory. Something more honest than either. Something that looked like a man recognizing the shape of a situation he had been inside without fully seeing. My father looked at me for a long moment. And then he said, quietly, in the particular voice he used when he was saying something that cost him, "This is good work." It was not an apology. It was not a full accounting. It was 3 words, and they were real, and they landed in me like something I had been waiting for long enough that I had stopped consciously waiting. "Thank you," I said. "What do you need from us to make it work?" he said. Not to Gary. To me. And there it was. The question I had never been asked. The contract was signed 2 weeks later. The consulting scope was formalized. I began working with Vasquez Fabrication's operations team in the first month, and the production scheduling improvements I had outlined were implemented over the following quarter. The margin recovery was real and measurable. By the end of the first 6 months, the business was running at the efficiency level I had projected, and the Henderson relationship, stabilized by the new structure, became, as intended, the anchor of a significantly more profitable operation. My father and I had a conversation, about a month into the engagement, that I want to tell you about because it is the most honest thing that has ever passed between us. We were at the shop, on the floor, which was a place I had never been invited as a child, and which I was now walking through professionally, looking at the production setup I had spent months analyzing on paper. My father was beside me, pointing out equipment, explaining processes, doing the thing he had always done with Marco and never with me. He stopped at a machine that was central to the scheduling bottleneck and said, "You knew about this before you even proposed to Henderson." "Yes," I said. "How long?" 3 years. He was quiet. "I tried to mention it once," I said. "You told me to leave the shop floor to the people who knew it." Another quiet. Longer. "I was wrong about you," he said. "Not I'm sorry. Not I should have seen it. Not any of the fuller versions of the accounting that this moment might have held." But he said it. Raymond Vasquez, who had not been wrong in the direction of his daughter in 30 years, said, "I was wrong about you." I looked at the machine in front of us. "I know," I said. We stood there for a moment in the noise of the production floor, the sound of the business he had built, that was now, in a real and formal sense, also mine to protect. "You named the company Vasquez Operations," he said. "Yes." "Why?" I thought about the answer for a moment. "Because the name was mine too," I said. "It was always mine too. I just had to build something worthy of it on my own." He looked at me. And for the first time in my life, I saw my father's pride directed at me in the full, unfiltered form, not the compressed version, not the beside-the-point version, not the "well that's nice" version. The real thing. It arrived 30 years late. And it was still the most significant thing he had ever given me. Marco and I had our own conversation, separate from my father's, a few weeks into the engagement. He came to me directly, which I respected, and said what he needed to say without decorating it. "I didn't know how much you had been shut out," he said. "I knew there was an imbalance. I didn't know the full shape of it." "I know you didn't," I said. "I'm not going to pretend it's simple," he said. "You coming in here and saving the Henderson contract, it's good for the business. It's hard for me, personally. I need to be honest about that." "I appreciate the honesty," I said. "I also need to ask you something," he said. "Is this about helping the business? Or is this about what Dad did to you?" I thought about this question carefully. Because Marco deserved a careful answer. "Both," I said. "And I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But here's what I can tell you, the work is real. The improvements are real. The results I deliver will be real. Whatever my personal reasons for being here, the professional outcome is what I said it would be. You can evaluate me on that." He nodded. Slowly. "Okay," he said. "That's fair." We shook hands. It was not warmth exactly, we had too much history and too much recent complication for warmth. But it was real. And real, as I have learned, is worth more than the performance of warmth. My mother called me the night after the Henderson meeting. Late, after my father had gone to sleep. She called from the kitchen, I could tell from the ambient sound, and she spoke in the quiet voice she used when she was saying something she had been holding for a long time. "I should have said something," she said. For years. I should have pushed back. Yes, I said. You should have. I know that's not easy to hear from me. No, I said. But it's true, and I'd rather have the truth. She was quiet for a moment. Your father is going to take some time, she said. To fully process this. I know, I said. I'm not waiting for him to process it. I'm working. The processing is up to him. That's very, she paused. That's very you. Yes, I said. It is. She made a sound that was close to a laugh and close to a cry. The sound of a woman who is proud and guilty in equal measure and doesn't know how to hold both at once. I love you, Elena, she said. I love you too, Mom, I said. Work on the silence. That's what I need from you going forward. She said she would. I believe she's trying. Here is where I am now. Vasquez Operations Consulting is, 2 years after the Henderson meeting, a firm with 7 clients and 4 employees. The Vasquez fabrication engagement is ongoing and has produced the results I projected. The Henderson relationship is the strongest it has been in the company's history. My father has, in the specific and limited way of men who have been formed by decades of certain beliefs, been revising those beliefs slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. Marco is running the client relationships, which is genuinely what he's good at. I am running the operations, which is genuinely what I'm good at. We have found, in the past year, a working dynamic that respects what each of us brings, not because the history is resolved, but because the work is real and the results are real and reality has a way of organizing people around what's true. My father came to my office 2 months ago. First time he'd been there. He looked around at the space I had built, modest but professional, with the specific order that operations consultants tend to impose on physical spaces, and he said, "This is good, Elena." 2 years ago, those 3 words would have been the entire point. Now they are just one thing among many. The business is the point. The work is the point. The life I have built, on ground entirely of my own making, with tools I acquired myself, in the face of every reasonable reason to believe it wasn't possible, that is the point. My father's approval is something I receive now rather than chase. It is the difference between those things is the whole story. I want to end by telling you what I believe this story is actually about. It is not about a father who was wrong, although he was. It is not about a daughter who proved something, although I did. It is not about the satisfaction of a moment, although the Henderson meeting was everything I needed it to be and I am not going to pretend otherwise. It is about what happens when you stop asking someone else to determine your value and start determining it yourself. My father had a framework for who mattered and how. I was outside that framework. For years, I operated as though the goal was to be included in it, to be acknowledged, to be seen, to receive the recognition that the framework had decided to allocate elsewhere. The day he told me I wasn't worthy, something shifted. Not because his judgment changed. Because I finally stopped giving his judgment the authority to be the last word on the subject. I built something. Not to prove him wrong, although that was part of it, and I will own that part honestly. I built something because the building was what I was capable of, and no one else's limited view of my capabilities was going to determine whether I used them. The most powerful act of my life was not the Henderson meeting. The most powerful act of my life was the drive home from my parents' house, with the radio off and the windows down, when I made the decision, alone, without anyone's permission, without anyone's encouragement, to become undeniable. You do not need anyone's permission to become undeniable. The people who doubt you are not the obstacle. They are the fuel, if you use them right. My father gave my brother the house, the car, the business, and the legacy. He gave me something better, without meaning to. He gave me a reason. And I built an empire on it.